Daf Zion Omid Base 7b. You can see on the screen, you'll see where we are. There's the top. We are about a quarter of the way down. Yeah. Okay, fairly simple sugya this evening, a number of different opinions. So we're back to the Mishnah. Can everyone see it? Where the cursor is, where the two dots are. The Mishnah said, the very first Mishnah actually, the Mishnah said, so we're talking about things which posel a sukkah. Said the Mishnah, meruba misilasa pusula. The Mishnah said, one of the other things that posels a sukkah is when the amount of sun that penetrates it is greater than the shade it affords, then it's posel. So it says more. Now, the Mishnah doesn't seem to, if we look back to the Mishnah doesn't seem to qualify that and to explain where the shade should be coming from. In fact, it says Rashi there just says, so Rashi was telling us, even if there's a little bit of sunlight coming through, that is negated by the majority of a shade. So Rashi said three things actually. Firstly, that the minimum, so it's all about majority. If the majority is shade, then the minority of sunlight coming through is negated. And therefore it's as if there's no sun whatsoever. And then he tells us, and this really is maybe a hint to where we're going to get to tonight. Says Rashi, and a sukkah is called, it gets its name from the idea of schach, from schach. So sukkah and schach are synonymous with one another, which means that without, what does schach mean? What does sukkah mean? As we'll see a posuk actually, it means covering. So the sukkah, the definition of a sukkah is an enclosure that is covered, meaning that it provides sufficient cover that the shade is more than the sun. So even if it's not total cover, as long as the majority is covered, even if there's a minority of penetration from sunlight, that is bottle, is barov, is negated by the majority, and that is called a sukkah. So that's a really important point. Rashi's almost setting out the stall, which is, it's the schach which defines the sukkah as a sukkah. It's synonymous with the term of sukkah, and therefore that is the schach which provides the shade. But we haven't said that explicitly. And the reason why I'm emphasizing that point is because now the Gemara says the following. Says the Gemara, Tana Rabbanan, it's taught in the Brisa, Chamasa machmas sikech, v'lo machmas stefonos. We have a Brisa that tells us that this requirement for the shade to be greater than the sunlight is the chamasa machmas sikech. Where does the shade come from? What is providing the shade that is critical to a kosher sukkah? Says the Brisa, from the schach. Chamasa machmas sikech. So what would possible it would be the sunlight coming through the schach. So the schach is so flimsy, so spread apart that it's not providing enough shade, too much sunlight. That's on account of the schach. However, it's not on account of the walls. So for example, you had walls, like we maybe discussed this a lot last time and previous times. Let's say you've got walls with gaps in them. As long you've got boards, planks of wood with less than 3 tefachim between them to the next, but they're open, it's slatted. Yeah, excuse me. Don't worry, it's not COVID, just a sneeze. So you've got a sukkah with at least, let's say, 2 and a bit walls, or even 3 or 4 walls, but there's got gaps in them, and that's allowing sunlight to penetrate into the sukkah. What happens if the sukkah is bathed in the sunlight because of the gaps in the wall? Would that be possible or not? What is the Brisa telling us? So it's the sun. The critical element is it the schach that's allowing too much sunlight in? Yes, says the Brisa, and not on account of the walls. Look at Rashi. Here. on the left-hand side. Chamasa machmas sikeich, says Rashi. So the sunlight is on account of the schach. Poselespa. It is the schach which is making the sukkah possible because it's not providing enough shade. V'lo chamasa machmas stefanos. And they were not worried about the sunlight on account of the walls. So what would appear from this is, as long as the schach is providing enough shade more than there is sunlight, even if sunlight is streaming through the walls, we're not worried. It's a kosher sukkah. Okay? Why? And that comes back to what Rashi was alluding to in his comment, which is that the definition of a sukkah is the schach. It's the schach which has to be sufficient enough to provide more shade than sun. If not, then it's possible. So regardless of whether the walls are sufficient enough to provide shade or not, that would appear for the Brisa. That's not an issue. That's the Tanakh. That's the Tanakhama in our Brisa. Go back in the Brisa. We have a machlokas. Says the Brisa, Rabbi Yoshia Omer, Rabbi Shia Omer. Rabbi Shia says, Af machos stefanos. No, he would say, no, even the sunlight on account of the walls. Said Rabbi Yoshia that if the walls also don't provide more shade than sunlight, then the sukkah would be possible. So even if you have perfectly valid schach, which was providing more shade than the sunlight, but if the walls were constructed in such a way that they were allowing more sunlight to come through, then according to Rabbi Yoshia, then the sukkah would also be possible. It says the Gemara explains what's going on here. So Amar Rav Yema bar Shleimei Mishmei Dabaya. My time to Rabbi Yoshia. What is the reason? Where does Rabbi Yoshia derive this idea that the walls also have to provide shade? So Gemara answers, because the Pasuk says in Shemos, in relation to the Mishkan, we'll read about this in a moment, in relation to the Mishkan, says the Torah, V'sakota ala Aaron es haparoches, and it's talking about the Aaron Kodesh in the Kodesh HaKodashim. Says the Torah that we know, as we know, that the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies, was separated from the rest of the Beis HaMikdash, the rest of the Mishkan, using a paroches, a curtain. Yeah, and that's why in Shul we have a paroches in front of the Aron Kodesh, because it is redolent of the Beis HaMikdash. So just as in the Beis HaMikdash and the Mishkan is separated the Aron, which is in the Kodesh HaKodashim, with a paroches, so too we separate the Aron Kodesh in Shul and the rest of the Shul with a paroches. So says the Torah, V'sakota ala Aron es haparoches. The paroches, the curtain, shall Sukkota ala Aaron, shall cover Sukkota, yeah, from the same word as schach and Sukkot, Sukkota, to cover over the Aaron. So the curtain shall cover over the Aaron. Says the Gemara, how's that the basis of Rabbi Yoshia's ruling that the walls also have to provide a shade? Says the Gemara, paroches mechitza. The paroches was not a horizontal covering; it was a vertical covering. It was a mechitza. It was a wall. And therefore, says the Gemara, and yet the Torah calls it schacha. Uses the terminology of the sukkota. You shall use it to cover with the same terminology as the word schach. Alma mechitza schach ba'inan, and the Roshua derives from that we see that a mechitza also has to be like schach. According to Roshua, the Torah, we can infer from this pasuk that the Torah is calling this sakota, this idea of covering a mechitza, well, it is a mechitza, it's a wall. And we see that the wall has to provide the quality of the sukkota, of covering. And therefore, just as the covering of the schach has to be more shade than sun, so too the walls also have to provide more shade than sun. Says Rashi, Haroches mechitzahi. So the wall is a mechitza. The pasuk says, how do we know that it's talking about this paroches was a wall and not a horizontal covering? Because the pasuk says, "V'hivdila haparoches lachem." The paroches shall divide for them, meaning it shall divide in a vertical space the Aron HaKodesh in the Kodesh HaKodashim from the rest of the Mishkan of Beis HaMikdash.
How would Rashi have known this? Can you tell me what is it? Just based on Midrashim?
No. So what she's saying is so the pasuk says V'sukota ala Aron es haparoches. The Torah says you shall cover the paroches shall cover the Aron. Rashi says it doesn't mean from above; it means vertically.
I understand.
Because the pasuk says v'hivdila haparoches lachem. It shall divide. So putting it on top of the Aron Kodesh is not going to be dividing the Aron Kodesh from the rest of the Kodesh from the rest of the Mishkan or the Beis HaMikdash, because it's going to be open still.
But presumably Rashi, I mean, he lived in 1100 or 12. There must have been Batei Knesset, synagogues, which already had curtains based on a previous tradition where they separated out. I mean, there's lots of synagogues in North Africa and the Galil, wherever they were, Iraq, Mesopotamia, that had curtains. They must have known how it was from tradition rather than from Rashi. Rashi himself only saw what he saw in the synagogues.
I agree 100%. But Rashi's not commenting on that. Rashi's not giving us a cue as to how to build a shul or the Mishkan. He's telling us that we have two pasukim. One pasuk says that the paroches shall act as a covering.
Yes.
Rashi says, what does that mean? He says, well, let's look at another pasuk. When it tells us that the paroches shall act as a havdalah, a division, a divider, a partition. Rashi tells us the only way that the paroches can act as a partition from the rest of the space is if it's running vertically, not horizontally.
Yeah.
Con?
Okay. Yes.
Maybe.
Yes. Understand. Yes. Sorry.
That's fine. That's the point. That's the point Rashi's making. The Rabbi Yeshua is telling us. Well, in fact, actually, So what Rabbi Yeshua is going to say is what he's saying is, since the Torah refers to a mechitza, a vertical partition in the loshon of schacha, referring to as some type of covering, it's equating it with the halachas of the schach, and just as the schach has to provide more shade than the sun, so too do the walls. Perfectly logical. Yeah. So what about the Tanakama? What about the Rabbanan in that brisa? Why don't they make the same implication from this pasuk? So says the Gemara, V'Rabbanan hahu denekuf bei purta demechaze kaschach. So the Rabbanan, the rabbis in the brisa would say, okay, that pasuk actually is not telling us that you should cover it. We can't make the equation between the schach and the walls having the same halacha. They would say that the Torah is telling you, when it uses the word for sukota, it's telling you, yes, the vertical wall curtain, the paroches, which goes up vertically, needs to nekuf bei purta, a part of it needs to curl over on top. So it provides you with both vertical partition and horizontal as well. So a little bit going over the top. To mechaze kaschach, and therefore it would appear like schach. That's why it says. So the Rabbanan would say the reason why the Torah uses the loshon of v'sukota, you shall cover it, is not to tell you that the walls and the schach should be the same halachas. They both should have to provide shade. Rather to tell you that the paroches goes up vertically, goes over across, so it appears to be a little bit like schach itself. And that's why the Torah chose the term v'sukota to allude to that requirement of the paroches going over. If you look at Rashi says leikuf bei lemala purta, so it needs to bend over from above a little bit, ke'en gag, like a roof, yaseh mixasa, to be used a little bit, to use a little bit of the vertical. Again, it's like our dofen akum, our dofen akuma, our bent wall. So it's going up and it's curling over to give a little bit of cover above. And that's what that pasuk is doing. And therefore, so the Rabbanan, you can't infer like Yoshua does, that pasuk is telling us that the halacha, the din in relation to the walls, is the same din in relation to the schach. Okay, so that being the case,
so does that hold with the instructions given on how to construct it? Because the instruction...
In what way?
So all the instructions were about the pillars and then the curtains at the top and the rest of it. I don't recall that it says and then the curtain should bend over a bit or anything like that.
No, you're right. It doesn't say explicitly. It doesn't say explicitly. And the Rabbanan I'm inferring it from the possible, the fact that the Torah shows that word, Besukotah, that it should cover, it should be like schach. Rabbanan would say that it needs to go up vertically and come over slightly over the top. Okay. That's how they understand the posuk. Another question is going to be to Rabbi Yoshia. So we don't pass on like Rabbi Yoshia. We pass on the Rabbanan that it's the schach. The requirement is that the schach provides sufficient shade, and it doesn't matter. So even if, let's say, you've got completely see-through walls. So, for example, let's say you've got. My parents used to make a schach. They used to like very heavy polythene. You used to have like a gazebo there. They would encircle it with very heavy polythene, secured to the posts. The sun would be beating on a very hot summer day. The sun will be coming straight through, and you've got the sukkah is full of sun. There's no shade in that sukkah whatsoever. Okay, you've got shade coming from above, but obviously it's coming in at an angle below the schach. There's no shade whatsoever. That's perfectly fine because the requirement is that only the schach provides shade and not the walls. Now, let's just look at Rabbi Yoshua a second, because if you think back to what we've been learning in terms of the halachas in relation to the walls, what issue would Rabbi Yoshua's position in relation to the walls having to provide more shade than the sun imply to what we've said previously about how the walls could be constructed?
As long as the schach covers, because you've got a tiny little bit of wall, haven't you? You've got 2.5. You've got 2 and a bit, rather.
Yeah.
So as long as the schach covers over all of it, doesn't fall through the middle of whatever you've set up as your walls, that's the schach will cover it. Surely that's the idea, isn't it?
Yeah.
Make it one long cover so you keep out the sun.
Agreed. But I'm just talking about, as I'm saying, that's how we passed it. But according to Rabbi Yoshia, he would say that the walls also have to provide sufficient shade as well.
Only if you've got enough.
Well, yes. So that's the point. So how can you say such a thing? You understand the question?
Yeah, because you're allowed gaps in the walls, aren't you?
Right. So, and we saw. Do you remember we saw last week? We saw that the idea of the walls being shesi v'lo erev or erev v'lo shesi. So they don't even need to be crisscross walls. They could be just horizontal or vertical. Now, vertical, we understand that could provide, the shade could, if they're going all the way from floor to ceiling, then it's likely that they will be, depending on the position of the sun, they could be blocking out the sun coming through. But what happens if you do erev lo shesi, which is horizontal walls? You could have. We talked about the boxing ring. Yeah, the boxing ring construction is you've got posts at each 4 corners, and you string round tightly around it ropes. As long as there's less than 3 tefachim vertically between them, kosher sukkah. Now that's going to be flooding light into it, isn't it? Yeah. So if we turn back, let me see if I can do it quickly on here. If you just turn back to the previous Amud, to Zion Amud Aleph, you see there's a Tosfos there. It's a short Tosfos here. Shaloi. So we said that the sukkah is kosher. Can you see that over here on the left-hand side? We said previously last time that you could be shesi v'lo erev shesi, as long the only requirement is that at least there's at least less than 3 tefachim between each of the solid material. Says Tosfos, shlot yehei ben kana lechaveiro shlosh tefachim. So there shouldn't be between each board or beam 3 tefachim. Says Tosfos, Ein Zek Rabbi Yoshia. This is not like Rabbi Yoshia. To besamach close by, meaning on Daf Zayin Omid base. To buy mechitzas keschach silasa merube mechamasa, who requires that the walls should be like the schach, meaning that their shade should be greater than their sun. Let me see what that Zayin, where that Zayin goes to. No change. Yeah, so you see Tosfos heads off the question that we see here. So what's the answer? Rabbi Yoshia just doesn't hold by that. He would say a sukkah made like that with gaps of less than 3 tefachim is no good to start with, because he would say the walls need to be like the schach, and therefore they need to be providing just as much shade as the schach does as well. Okay, so we don't pass them like that, but it's just interesting to see. Okay, let's go back to where we were. Okay, can you see that? Okay, so having seen this opinion of Rabbi Yoshia in relation to the requirement of the sukkah, we're now going to see a number of different opinions. We're almost going to play rabbinic poker here, almost like you've got a stringency. Rabbi Yoshia, your stringency was the walls have to provide the same amount of shade as the schach. We're going to see. Well, I'll see that stringency and I'll add to it. So we're going to see a number of different, increasingly stringent requirements for the kashrus of a sukkah. Says the Gemara. Where are we? Yeah, here. Amar Abaya. So Abaya says, Rabbi Yoshia, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Gamliel, Ubei Shammai, Rabbi Eliezer, V'acherim, Kulu Svirelei Sukkah. Diras keva ba'inan. So all of them and others are of the opinion that a sukkah has to be a permanent structure. It needs to be constructed in a way that it is sufficiently stable and permanent. All of them say this. Now we're going to go through each one in turn, how they define that. First look at Rashi though. What does it mean, Diras keva? Says Rashi, where are we? Here we go, Diras Keva. Roi lishtamesh kavua v'niras kabayis. Says Rashi 2 things. It has to be constructed in a way where it's fit to be used in a permanent way, and it appears to be like a house. So we say about sukkahs that teishvu ke'en kadura, that we dwell in the sukkah as we would dwell in our houses. So we're now going to see, the extent of this, that it has to be constructed in a way that can be used on a permanent basis. It could be used on a permanent basis, meaning it's sturdy enough that it could be built, or big enough that it could be used on a permanent basis. And also it appears to be like a house, meaning it has the same dinim as a house, meaning a person will be perfectly comfortable in it as they would be in their house. Having said that, says the Gemara, the first opinion. So let's start with Rebbe Yehuda Nasi, the redactor of the Mishnah. Rebbe, so what was Rebbe's opinion? The son is taught on the Baisa. Rebbe Omer, Kol Sukkah she'ein ba arba amos al arba amos besula. Rebbe would say, any sukkah which isn't at least 4 amos by 4 amos is possible. Why would he say that? Because if you think back to when we learned about the concept of mechitzas, when we talked about the definition, remember we talked about the definition of a house in a chotzer, in a courtyard. We said the minimum definition of a house is if it is 4 by 4 amos. Yeah? And so even though we paskin that the minimum is mechitzas of 7 tefachim, so much less. 7 tefachim is far less than 4 daled amos. Daled amos is roughly about 6 foot by 6 foot. 7 tefachim would be roughly, or tefach says about 8 centimeters. So roughly about 35 centimeters by 35 centimeters. Far less, much less. Yeah. So Rebbe is very machmir, very stringent. He would say no. For it to be considered to be like a house and permanent, it has to be of the dimensions of 4 amas by 4 amas, otherwise it's possible. Okay, that's the first opinion. Says the next one, Rabbi Yoshia, so our Rabbi Yoshia, who we just saw, Hard Amran. That's what we saw. So we saw Rabbi Yoshia's opinion is that for it to be considered to be a kosher sukkah, for it to be considered to be permanent, it has to be constructed in a way that the walls provide as much shade as the schach does, i.e., more shade than sunlight. If not, it's far too temporary, not like a house. You wouldn't live in a house where there's more sunlight coming in than there is shade, and therefore it would be possible. Next opinion, Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion, the son is Lord Tut in the Mishnah. We quoted it earlier on, actually, on base Omid Aleph. Sorry, in our Mishnah. Sukkah is, sorry, it's our Mishnah, the very first Mishnah. Son, our Mishnah said, Sukkah shehi gavoa lemala mechaf ama pasula. Our Mishnah, Tanakama Mishnah said that a sukkah which is higher than 20 amas is possible. And remember, we spent a lot of time on that. Yeah, why? Because the person doesn't look up, they don't see the schach, because it was built in a permanent way. We said that was another reason we said. So the Tanakama says that's possible. Rabbi Yehuda machshir, and yet we saw the Rabbi Yehuda says no, it's kosher, which means he's of the opinion that only if it's 20 amas high is it kosher. If it's less than 20 amas high, it's not permanent, because anything less than 20 amas could be built in a temporary way. And he said it's possible. The sukkah needs to be a permanent structure, and therefore only if the walls are 20 amas high would it be kosher, because otherwise it wouldn't be permanent. All very straightforward, yes? Gemara goes on. Rabbi Shimon, down here, Rabbi Shimon, the decided it's also in the Brisa, base Kihil Chasan, the Gimel Afilu Tefach. So we saw this in the Brisa, that we say that that based on those words, Vasukos, we say that the sukkah needs to have 2 full walls, and a third one, even if it's a tefach, then it's kosher. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says no. Gimel Kihil Chasan, V'dalad Afilu Tefach. No, he would say no. Based on Vasukos, he would say it has to have at least 3 full walls and a 4th, even if it's a tefach. Now, why would he say that? You look at Rashi. What was Rabbi Shimon's? We saw Rabbi Shimon's opinion previously again on Daf Vav Omid Beis, so the previous Daf. Yeah, because he quotes a posuk. I can go back to it if you want. Rashi quotes it here. Here. Shalosh Kil Chasan. So Rabbi Shimon would say, no, you need 3 full walls and a 4th one, even a tefach. Why? Upashin time lamala. We explained the reason earlier, based on the posuk, and I think the posuk was a posuk in Yirmiyahu, if I remember rightly. No, in Yeshayahu. The sukkah should be a shade for you in the day from the heat. And it should be a shelter and a refuge from the wind and from the rain. So he said there that it has to provide both a shelter and a refuge. Rashi there said, without 4 walls, meaning 3 full walls and a 4th a little bit, that cannot provide you protection from the wind. Why? Why? Because the wind will find the opening. If you've only got 2 walls and a bit, you've got a full 3rd wall side open and another bit pretty much open as well. The wind's just going to go enter in there. You're not going to get any protection from the elements in a sukkah of only 2 walls and a bit. Therefore, it has to be at least 3 walls and a bit. And again, for something to be considered permanent, it has to have that amount of walls. Otherwise, it's not, it wouldn't be considered to be like a house. It wouldn't be considered to be permanent. It's far too flimsy and temporary.
But it's ironic because on the one hand, it's meant to be a protection against the wind and shade. On the other hand, it's meant to be flimsy because it's remind us of the temporary nature of the dwelling.
Yeah.
So you've got both aspects.
Yeah, that's right, and that's why, in fact, we don't. Although we're quoting all these opinions, we don't pass them like this. We're perfectly happy with, and we actually pass it. It should be a diras ri. It should be temporary. Okay, how temporary? We say that there's, for example, if the walls are so flimsy that a ruach matzui, and we see the Tosfos mentions this later, a ruach matzui, if for example, even a regular wind would make the walls move more than 3 tefach in one direction, and that will be considered too flimsy. So there are limits. All right, it can't be a paper thin sukkah that will just blow away in the wind. In fact, we're going to come on to that in a moment. It's got to have at least some amount of protection, but how much is a source of debate. We don't go so far as saying it needs to be permanent. Yeah, we're happy for it as long as it is enough to withstand a mild, a regular wind. It's sufficient. Yeah, obviously, if there's a gale force, when was it 87? Yeah, no sukkah was expected to survive that. No sukkah needs to be built in a way to survive that sort of storm, right?
It's funny though, because in Israel, as you know, there are most of the non-religious families also build a sukkah for the children. It's massive all over the place. And after the second, third day, it's only the religious ones which are still standing because none of them have bothered to build it properly.
Right. It's like I remember years ago once I was when I was a rabbi in Reading. I got invited to the local church. It was called the Christian Friends of Israel. They were very, very pro-Israel, very pro-Jewish, and they invited me to come and speak about the significance of tabernacles for both Jews and non-Jews alike. Anyway, I got there and they'd built a sukkah inside the church.
Oh. And
I joked to them that theirs is probably better constructed than anyone that a Jewish person can construct. More likely to survive than ours would. Obviously generalizing, I know for myself, Anyway, so yes, so interesting. So again, these are all what we'd say chumras in terms of the relative sturdiness and permanence of them. But even though we don't paskin like that, we would still say there has to be a minimum amount of resilience, shall we say. Okay, so that was Reb Shimon. We don't paskin like Reb Shimon that we need 3 walls and a bit. We say only 2 and a bit. Okay, next one. Right, Rabban Gamliel. End of the line. Rabban Gamliel, the Tanya is brought in a brisa. Ha'oseh sukas, and this is later on in Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph. Ha'oseh sukasoi berosh ha'agala o berosh ha'sfina. The person builds their sukkah on top of a wagon or on top of a ship. Rabban Gamliel posel. Rabban Gamliel says it's possible. Rabbi Akiva machshir, whereas Rabbi Akiva says no, it's kosher. Look at Rashi. Rosh Hasfina says Rashi. Where are we? Rosh Hasfina. Shigavoa me'oid kasfinos hayam. So what you built it's very high up. It's very far off the ground, like a ship on water. Shein gedolos, which are very big. V'haruach ba'a v'okarasa. And the wind comes along and uproots it. So since it's very exposed, I think he was saying, he's saying is even if it's not actually built on the ship itself, if you build it so high up, let's say, you build it on top of a roof, for example, and it's very high, and therefore the wind higher up is more powerful, it could come and uproot the sukkah, and therefore it doesn't have the din of kavua, of permanence. Uvarosh agala, Nami, says Rashi, and also on top of the wagon also will be the same. Kiva the naide, since it shakes around, presumably when the wagon is moving, it's wobbling all over the place. Therefore, it appears to be temporary. Yeah. Although it may be perfectly solid, but because by the nature of it being on the back of a wagon and it's the roads are very uneven and it's bouncing all over the place, it appears to be very flimsy and very temporary, and therefore would be possible. In fact, if you look at Tosfos here, lower down, could have looked at this earlier. So Tosfos here. So we remember we introduced this by saying Abaya said, he quoted Rabbi Oshia, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Gamliel, Beis Shammai, Rabbi Eliezer, V'acherim, and others. Kulul Svirilahu Sukkot Diras Keva Ba'inan. He ended by saying all of them, they all are of the opinion that a sukkah has to be permanent. Says Tosfos, and I think maybe a bit tongue in cheek. He says, "Kulus virulei diras keva ba'inan." Everyone said, all of them agree that the sukkah needs to be permanent. Al kocha ein shavin. He says we're forced to say actually they don't all agree. When do you ever find people will agree? And what it means is that to a certain extent they all agree of the concept of the requirement of permanence. However, the definition of permanence is different. As we see, he goes on and says Tosfos, Taharebi by Dalet Amos, because we saw Rebbe requires it to be, he would say, as long as you got 4 Amos, by 4 Amos it's kosher, regardless of whether it's some of the other requirements the others require. Ube Shammai would say, Sagi b'dei Rosho v'rubo v'shulchanoi, whereas Rebbe Shammai, as we're going to see in a moment, would say, not about how big it is, it's about what it is, about how big it is, but not by dimensions, but by whether you could fit your head, the majority of your body, and your table into it. So each of them will have a different definition of what permanent is, but so Tosfos is saying they don't agree necessarily with each other's definition, but in principle they agree that there needs to be a certain level of permanence. And then he goes on and says a little bit further, just having a look. Coach Rabbi Gamliel, where were we? It's the next Tosfos actually. Look at the next Tosfos. Ha'oseh. So Tosfos says Ha'oseh sukaso. Barosha Agala Barosha Haspina. So he makes his sukkah on top of a ship, or sorry, wagon or a ship. The Kaman Mefarish Perek Hayashan. So further on, we're going to see it explained. The Masnisin the Katani Kashera, Kasina Barosha Agala. So there we'll see in the Mishnah, we'll say that when you do it on top of a wagon, it's kosher. Whereas here in the Brisa, we see there's a machlokas between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Akiva. Remitondolo Garcina. So Rabbi Ben says no, we don't. The text isn't like that. So they say no, we have a different gift, a different text. In fact, the truth is they don't disagree about on top of a wagon. So we'll see on Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph they actually agree when it comes to a wagon. So this is what I mentioned earlier. Really, what they're arguing about is whether it could withstand an average, a moderate wind. Yeah. So it's not whether it's on the wagon per se, which is the issue, and that's why Rashi is forced into giving this answer of it moving around on the wagon. They're not arguing about that. They're arguing about where you position the sukkah. Could be on a wagon.
Where the conditions are similar to a wagon.
Yeah. And even if it's on a wagon, what's the defining feature is whether a moderate wind would cause it to flap around. If it does, then they would agree it's possible. If it doesn't, then there's machlokus. And that's on dry land. But what about on the water? What about when it's on a ship? So even there, with a moderate wind, we'd say no. So that way we can push that off. It goes on a bit further and it says, given the Naidele. So that's why Rashi was forced into saying it's not about an average, a moderate wind. It's about the fact that it shakes around the movement of the wagon. That doesn't make sense. That's what Rashi's saying. Well, the truth is, he says on a ship is also going to move around by the movement of the ship itself. So therefore, why do I need the explanation, which is that it can't withstand the moderate wind on the yam, at the sea? We can explain it there, that in relation to what we explained there further on in Chaf Aleph Omid Aleph, Gabe Sukkah the Samcha B'Korei Ha'amita. So like a person who puts their sukkah, who supports it on the beams of a bed. So I think the difference is that even a Ruach Matzah at sea is going to be more, not dangerous is the wrong word, but at sea, it's even a moderate wind is going to cause more movement of the sukkah than it would on dry land, and therefore that's why Rashi gave it a different explanation. On dry land, we're not necessarily worried about the moderate wind. We're more worried about the movement from the wagon itself. Whereas at sea, even a moderate wind would cause us concern, because a moderate wind at sea has greater effect on the sukkah than on dry land. Okay, back in the Gemara. Yeah, Beis Shammai. We mentioned this in Tosfos. Now we'll see it inside. Here we are. Beis Shammai. The Snan is taught in the Mishnah. We quoted it on Gimel Omid Aleph. Mi shahaya rosha v'ruba b'sukkah v'shulchana b'toch habayis. By Beis Shammai, a person who basically machshirin, a person whose sukkah is so small that only his head, the majority of his body, and his table can fit in the sukkah. Beis Shammai would posel it, whereas Beis Hillel would say it's kosher. Yeah, again, there we said, because since it's so small, we're concerned that when a person's sitting at the table, he's going to be leaning inside and therefore not be in the sukkah while he's eating, and therefore is not fulfilling the mitzvah of dwelling in the sukkah. And again, because it's so small, he's not going to be comfortable to be able to do so, and therefore he's going to end up going inside. So according to Beis Shammai, that type of sukkah would be possible. So he would require it to be big enough to contain at least, look at Rashi. He would require it to release at least your head, your majority of your body, and your table. Why? Where are we? Let's further up here. Beis Shammai, here we go. Beis Shammai poslin to royal the tashmish ba'inen. But Beis Shammai is of the opinion that the sukkah has to be big enough for you actually to use it, meaning sit in it, eat in it, dwell in it. Yeah, and if it's not, then it's not kosher. Okay, back in the Gemara. Last couple of opinions. Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Eliezer of the opinion, the Snan is taught in a Mishnah further on. You test on my base. Ha'oseh sukaso kamin srif or samcha lekotel. Rabbi Eliezer posel. If a person makes their sukkah like a cone, meaning like a triangle, right? So so circular and the walls meet up at the top, or samcha lekotel, or they lean it up against the wall of the sukkah, is leant up against a wall. Rabbi Eliezer posel. Rabbi Eliezer says it's possible. Why? Because it doesn't have a roof. Because the walls and the roof are one and the same thing. Whereas the Chachamim say that's kosher. Look at Rashi, come in Srif. Over here. Gaga, Utafonasea, Be'en Ke'echad. Be'en Ke'echad. So the roof and the wall, so its roof and its walls come together as one. Ke'ein Kvarach, like a beehive. She'ein Gag Nika Levad. Utafonas Levad. And in this circumstance, the wall, so that the roof and the walls are not distinct on their own. or Karen Rashi, or Smucha Lokotel, or it's close to the wall or lent up against the wall. Asa Kamim Aruchim, Samach Rosha Echad Mote ala Kotel. So you use very long boards, wide boards, and you lean them up, the top of them up against the wall. They're leaning up against the wall. Varosha Acha Mote ala Aret, and the other wall, and the other end is leaning against the ground. To Gaga V'Dofna Echad. Again, the roof and the wall are one. She'ena gag v'ein na'el adira. It doesn't have a roof, and therefore it's just not nice to dwell in it. It's going to be too cramped. It's going to be unpleasant. It doesn't have what you can't look out. You can't look up and out of the schach, and it's just not nice. And therefore, a person won't want to spend their time in there. Again, it's not ke'ein tadura. It's not like their normal home, and it's not has no permanency. And it's not fit to be inhabited, and therefore it's not kosher according to Beis Shammai. Okay, back in the Gemara, and last one. That was Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer Chachamim. Acherim says. So others say, and Acherim is always the name we give for Risha ben Abua, who went became an Apikoros. So they just call him Acherim. Others, like not referring to him. The Sanya, it's also the Brisa. Acherim Omrim Sukkah Asuyi Kashovach Pasula. A sukkah which is made like a dovecote is possible. Lefish Ein Lo Zavis, because it doesn't have any corners. Says Rashi Kashovach Agula. It's round. You see that? You see, I don't know why the Gemara needed to put that in there. You see the diagram. Yeah. Yeah, it's circular.
It's always more exciting when there are pictures.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. Yeah. We'll see more next time on that.
I don't know how exciting the pictures last week were. It was pretty dry, with putting a line here and a line there.
Okay. Whatever you like, we don't like.
Now.
Yeah. In fact, I actually mean that circle maybe actually doesn't refer to our bit. It actually refers to what Rabbi Yochanan is going to say. We'll see that next time. Yochanan says you make sukaso kivshan. The person makes a sukkah like a kivshan, an oven.
Yeah.
An oven, a stove. Yeah. So, and we're looking down on it now, looking down through the opening of the stove. Yeah. So there's a ground space. He would say, Rabbi Yochanan would say, if there's enough internal space that you could sit 24 people around it, it's kosher. V'im lav pasula. Okay.
Where the oven actually is to make a sukkah, you mean?
No. You make it in the shape of an oven.
Shape of an oven.
Meaning circular. You make it circular. Yeah. And this is where we. Sorry.
If it was on the oven, at least it would be warm.
It would be warm. Yeah, but maybe too warm to be able to stay there. Yeah.
Surely it doesn't matter here because the circle has an infinite amount of sides.
Very good point. And that's what we're going to see, Mr. Hashem, next time. We're going to get into the calculation of pi. Yeah, because if you look you look on the next Amud, Ches Amud Aleph, you'll see that a circle can fit into a square and a square can fit into a circle. So we're going to look at how you arrange the seating. Will depend on how you accommodate people. Yeah. So yes, infinite it may be, or you could look at it and say actually there's no sides whatsoever. Yeah. Sorry. Actually, Tosfos, I know I said the Rish Ben Ali, but Tosfos setting is actually yes. Acherim here is referring to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir also went off the derech a little bit and referred to him as Acherim.
But it does permit a circular wall, I assume, even though there's infinite sides or there's no sides.
Yeah.
It permits a circular wall, does it?
A circular sukkah, yes. There's no issue with a circular sukkah. Yeah. Yeah. Only according to
there's this question then of a minimum of 2 and a bit walls or a minimum of 3 and a bit walls. How do you determine those in a sukkah? But I guess that's all for next week.
Well, no, because I mean that may be Mayor's point that since since it hasn't got the requisite number of walls, you could suggest that therefore it's possible. Yeah, I mean that's it's not really key. It just says she'ema zavios. It doesn't have corners, so therefore you can't define where one wall starts, another wall ends. Yeah, that may be his objection. I said we're going to need to go in and see what is this opinion. Why is this design possible? We say it's like Rebbe. I'm a Rebbe called Sukkah She'ein Ba'aba Amos Aba Amos Psula. Rebbe will say, well, if it hasn't got 4 Amos by 4 Amos, it's possible. Yeah, and therefore, again, how do you measure 4 Amos Dalad Amos by Dalad Amos when it comes to a circle? Okay, so we're going to say that there. So we're going to say, depending how you set out the seating in the sukkah, will depend how you measure it and define it. Okay, I said that's the whole another sukkah. We'll start next time. It's quite involved with quite a lot of calculations, maybe even more diagrams, as I said on the next onwards. So we'll do that next time. No shin next week, but please go the week after.
Good.